Christmas, Hanukkah, Saturnalia, Kwanzaa, St. Nicholas's Day, Yule. All of these international holidays fall around the 21st of December, which is the darkest day of the calendar year. Well, not for everyone in the world. In the north, we're often forgetting that the southern hemisphere exists. Even Kwanzaa, which is a celebration of African culture and identity, comes through the North American, African-American diaspora, and is a celebration mostly of various harvest traditions co-opted into a new form in a new context. But, at least in the Northern Hemisphere, these wintertime celebrations are distinct from harvest traditions. In fact, the point of many of these ancient traditions is to stave off the darkest days with fire, food, and festivity. Essentially, everything's cold and miserable, so let's have a party to lift the spirits. Usual features of this period involve a lack of fresh food, especially fresh fruit and vegetables. In fact, despite our expectation that snow around the holidays makes it ideal, that's not necessarily historically contiguous either. Generally, fire plays a really important role. The lighting of Advent candles, menorah, or the Yule log all play an equal part in kind of ritual activity and in staving off the darkness of those dark, lonely nights. And it is also true that this tends to be the time of year for feasting. Not on everyday foods, mind, but on those few delicacies that are able to survive into this season, often including dried, pickled and salted fruits, nuts and meats. These fruits, nuts and meats form an essential part of this feasting culture. These wintertime celebrations are genuinely testament to the indefatigability of human optimism. Despite everything being wrong for a party, there's no fresh food, there's not enough light, and the weather is terrible, we persist and defy the elements to ensure that ourselves and our community can survive this most sad of seasons. What I would like to do is discuss a couple of examples of fantasy works in which these sort of celebrations are represented in a way that meshes with the world building. And then we'll move into inventing festive holiday-style traditions for our own worlds, a variety of them, in many flavours of fantasy. Because we want wintertime festivals to feel familiar and cozy for our readers and players, but we don't want just another uninspired Christmas clone. First, I'm going to discuss the Feast of Winterfell from the World of Warcraft. This celebration borrows a lot from Christmas, right down to the Santa-esque Great Father Winter. But it does take things in an interesting direction. Much like St. Nicholas, Great Father Winter is actually a figure from history, a legendary, powerful entity who walks the land with a billowing cloak behind him. This cloak leaves snow in his wake, both signalling the end of life, the end of the season, but also a period of rebirth and renewal. As such, in the lore of Azeroth, the Feast of Wintervale is celebrated differently depending upon one's culture. Species like the dwarves and the orcs seek to claim Great Father Winter for their own, as part of their own culture's history. The dwarves even identify this figure as some ancestral progenitor of their people. More nature-focused cultures, like the Tauren, focus less on the figure of Great Father Winter and more on what is represented, the transition from snow through death into renewal and the advent of spring. All of this world building comes straight out of the setup of Azeroth, which has so many species and cultures and a legendary past filled with heroes, dragons, demons, and titans. Creatures in close conflict and competition tend to co-opt ancient myths. They often use distinctive, personalised retellings of the old foundational tales, twisting them to reflect shared cultural values in their specific units. Furthermore, in the world of Azeroth's modern landscape, the Feast of Winterveil, as this kind of pastiche of commercialised Christmas, makes some deal of sense. The world is in a state of competitive industrialization, especially considering warfare necessitates continuous development and presents ever-changing, ever more threatening threats. Even if the way things are set up in the World of Warcraft is slightly iffy, with the over-commercialization of the Feast of Winterveil largely being blamed on money-grubbing goblin families. The slightly commercial means something different to everyone's style festivity that is on display comes directly out of Azeroth's world building, even if it is very, very derivative. First, of the way that we see St. Nicholas, and second, of his Santa apparition in the modern commercialised Christmas time. Hogswatch is another pastiche of Christmas time. In this case, it's a caricature of the darker aspects of historic winter festival celebrations, mixed in with riffs on cultural touchstones very, very specific to English-speaking cultures. From traditions involving beans, to expectations of sacrifice and hunting, even right down to the Hogswatch name, which is just a pretty unsubtle riff on Hogmanay. Like much of Discworld, Hogswatch Night is decidedly British adjacent, with an eye towards the dark and absurd features of the historical past, as well as tying in really closely to the massive potential of belief in Discworld. In this kind of cyclical belief matrix, the Hogfather and by extension Hogswatch Night grow as traditions out of this fear turned good. This is why children's perspectives are so important in the lore of Hogswatch Night. They transform the Hogfather from this blood-soaked bogeyman with a hog theme to a figure who commits sausage-based charitable assaults and who grants some of the wishes of those kids who believe. The whole modern tradition for Discworld springs from this ancient past of horrific bogeymen being reinvented and dragged from horror to something ambiguous, which so happens to conform to the development of the superstitions of Britain and wider European paganism too. The Hogfather himself is a complex web of some of the darker and lighter Christmas time manifestations in Europe, from Krampus to Santa, to Nikolaus. In other words, the world of Discworld, a comically slightly dark take on society and culture, where belief is a central driving force in the creativity and spontaneous creation of things. A holiday night which ushers in the new year, partly born from the dreams and nightmares of children, stands pretty close to the world's core concept. So despite being rather obvious one-to-one retellings of some of the aspects of modern Christmas time celebration, both of these examples adhere quite well to the world's core fantasy. They don't feel incredibly incongruous. Although, to be honest, it would be hard to make something feel incongruous in both Azeroth and Discworld, as they're both very, very open settings, which keep the tongue firmly in the cheek. So if you're cool with a light, irreverent and referential tone, a kind of observational pastiche can work wonders for most worlds. But what if you want to create a cultural touchstone that feels really grounded in the world that you're presenting? Well, it's really hard to do that without knowing what your world is. See, both Blizzard and Pratchett make the clear decision to leave Jesus out of their pastiches, despite both clearly riffing on modern Christmas celebrations. Partly to avoid any strange implications, and partly because that sort of a story didn't fit what they were trying to do in their worlds. While Lewis focuses almost entirely on the Christ allegory, while also finding time to put Santa in near the end of The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. The key takeaway is really that we need to know our world and what the accepted normalcies are within it. Heck, both Discworld and Azeroth are strange places indeed when it comes to their setup. The former a famously flat plane, and the latter seems to have, well, little clear seasonal or climate patterns that aren't influenced in some way just by ley lines and developer magic. We'll start with a classic medieval European fantasy simulacrum. Standard fantasy, not D&D fantasy. Such a world is probably not the best place to just re-import some important cultural events from our world, such as, the birth of Jesus or the restoration of the Second Temple. But such a world could borrow from authentic medieval traditions. The Lord of Misrule, mummers' plays and all the like, and celebrate with festive foods like dried fruits and salted nuts. If you're looking for a clearer picture of the medieval Christmas, look no further than You're Dead to Me's Medieval Christmas episode, which gives a much clearer picture of some of these traditions than I have time to give here. The fires and lights lit in the darkness would likely be, in this sort of a world, an act of defiance against the monsters that lurk out in the darkness. Perhaps gifts, or sacrifices, or salted meats are left outside the city walls for any dragons or beasts that may come by, or any very brave poor folks from the surrounding regions. It might be that wreaths of garlic or wolfsbane are more commonly hung up than holly and mistletoe in these regions. And even tending the fire might become this sort of coming-of-age ceremony for the local youths, being expected to keep the fire going for a 10-day, like the Yule log tradition. Or the fire could be this kind of space for one's future path to be stated before, almost like a new year. A sort of a deadline, this celebration, for finding a master to apprentice under. It's possible that in some settings the feast and the fire might be spread, kind of like an Olympic torch, starting in the city and carried outwards to the surrounding villages by newly adult youths. When a torchbearer from the city carrying the great hearthfire of the city arrives in the village, only then can the celebrations and festivities begin. A nervous few nights, perhaps, of worrying if the lad coming to your village will have made it through the darkness. The image of dozens of newly adult youths riding out with torches of flame, carrying preserved treats and gifts for the surrounding villages, is a rather novel take on the kind of more classic fat old Santa situation. And it fits a darker, grounded fantasy world that much better. In terms of origin of this situation, any event can work. The glorification of a monarch or god, the famous slaying of some great monster, man or beast. But remember, these celebrations, in all honesty, really spring up because people are sad, lonely, and bored, and need to keep their spirits up. Next, a D&D styled fantasy world. Essentially, the same as the last one, but with far more monsters and a more potent magic system, with implications globally. We could go a couple of ways here. One is taking the major features of winter festivals and getting creative with the implications. Or two is creating a new mythos, legend, or lore as to why this festival occurs in the depths of midwinter. Either way, it's likely that people want to engage in this because it's dark and things aren't growing. It's also worth noting that D&D worlds tend to have a similar problem to Discworld and Azeroth in that there's so much going on, from furbolgs to fire giants, dragons to drow, and that's without mentioning the Gith or the Gif. It's highly likely that any unified celebration is only unified so far as cultural exchange is actually possible. Another interesting wrinkle is that these festivals largely only appeal to societies who can create fire share resources, preserve food, and have an established form of agriculture. There's not so much a need for these celebrations if your culture relies mostly on hunting and raiding. Sure, you might see a decrease in available meat to hunt or produce to raid from a local agrarian economy, but a celebration honouring that fact would really be nonsense. It's likely that the orcs, goblins, dragons, and semi-nomadic humans would be more likely to target such a celebration than host one themselves. After all, these are times when the civilized folks prepare special food, uncover and give away to others their most prized possessions. And really, they're tempting fate by standing out beside firelight in the deep darkness of winter, especially while lowering their defenses by drinking and making merry. A winter's festival is the perfect time for a raiding band to feed their hungry members' bellies. As such, winter celebrations might actually become a staging grounds for a sort of arms race with warding magic and greater guard patrols than ever before. Heck, perhaps these heightened defences have the unintentional knock-on effect of preventing the archfey who's taken upon themselves the gifting mantle from actually accessing the town or village in question, or create a grand deal of suspicion and concern between the citizens and their local Santa analogue. A city seeing Santa as some sort of new airborne raider for their winter festival is a very, very funny image. But we can also just move away from a modern Christmas expectation. This is a world of heroes, legends, and history. Winter festivals might instead be celebrations of ancient heroes, treaties signed, or wars won. Perhaps the whole celebration is Thanksgiving-esque, the only time when the humans are freely able to visit the elven lands, receiving a grand feast of magical foodstuffs well out of season, in thanks for this ancient treaty that the humans likely barely even have histories of. It is also worth noting that although I have impressed upon you that these celebrations largely happen as shelters from the cold and dark for a brief moment, they do tend to have a story behind them too. Whether it's a king giving gifts and shelter, the birth of a grand figure, or commemoration of some grand event, it's worth straying away from messiahs and Santa towards saints, bodhis, heroes of legend, and gods. They each make excellent patrons for a wintertime festival. But let's get a bit weirder. There's a surprising amount of fantasy world building that doesn't at all deal with seasonal change. Settings which focus on places entirely without cold weather, or who seem to balk at the idea of geographic simulationism. After all, we even see this in our own world with the Australian Christmas, which seems antithetical and absurd to Northern Hemisphere dwellers. A pleasant summer's day with sun, sandals, beaches, and sport? Heck, some of the expatriates from the Northern Hemisphere have conjured up a Christmas in July, one of the colder months, just to capture that kind of mid-winter feast feeling. So let's just assume for a moment a world without our regular seasonal climate, which we don't actually have to stretch a long way to imagine, just look to any equatorial climate. But how could a Christmas-esque celebration even function in such a bizarre and unusual place? First, they're unlikely to have the same origin for these events as modern-day winter festivities, unless we're abstracting to create this period in the world's history of darker days and less food. Perhaps a world given some waxing or waning source of sunlight with a strange orbit could see a similar effect. Or maybe magic itself waxes and wanes in a pattern that means that magical food is more or less potent or reliable. Alternatively, we can take some of the trappings of winter festivals and work backwards. Gift-giving, charity, and feasting can mark any event. Perhaps to finish a time of fasting like Lent or Ramadan. Perhaps equally we could use festivals of light as inspiration. Diwali comes to mind. It may be there's some semi-regular total eclipse where light becomes more sacred, springing off into a new tradition of light shows, thankfulness and gifting when the sun reappears. Perhaps, like in Azeroth, these seasons aren't particularly apparent, and instead some powerful elemental or fey creature travels the land, creating these traditional elements magically. I feel like Jack Frost, accepting a stint in The Rise of the Guardians, is this criminally underutilized folkloric figure to push this exact purpose. In my worlds, Jack Frost is a fey figure who taps on windows and lets people know that a cold snap is coming. But really the possibilities are endless. Perhaps there's a cursed locale, a place where there's this eternal winter festival, stuck in this magical blizzard that nonetheless other cultures travel to en masse to celebrate their own distinct holidays year round. Drinking and feasting like Oktoberfest or, the entire state of Bavaria. A kind of eternal winter party city sounds entertaining, if exhausting. But that's the thing, really. Winter festivals are a celebration. Of what? Why? Well, more reasons than we can count. It turns out we're pretty good at coming up with reasons to celebrate. So just make it up, but take some inspiration at least from lesser known sources if you can, and make sure that everything you include fits within your world unless you're deliberately going for anachronism. And because we humans love a good party, so too will your audience, if you put in the effort to give them one. Thank you for watching. I hope you've got some takeaways for building your own fascinating cultures and traditions, and that you have a wonderful and happy holidays if you're celebrating. Let me know your thoughts and opinions in the comments, and let me know any videos you'd like me to make in the future as well. But with all that said, I've been Tom, otherwise known as the Grungeon Master. Thank you so much for watching. Have a wonderful holidays, and I'll see you in the next video.